Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix. I'll be reading Chapter 16 from the novel Micronation today, called Return to Hler. I knew what I had to do. The plan was very clear. I intended to sneak into Hler and then create my own meme to counteract those that had come before Amberlove. In fact, I would ensure that there would be no more memes ever besides the harmless ones that occurred naturally. At least, that was my plan. While I had gotten out of the U.S. with no problems, my reception at Hler was less than stellar. They arrested me as soon as I arrived. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. Hler had a very small jail, and it smelled of vodka and fish. I waited 4 hours before Prow showed up looking unhappy.
Why didn't you answer your emails?
Because you're an idiot.
Don't start that, Chester.
Not Watson. Good sign.
What precisely?
What precisely is the charge I'm being held under? I asked.
Failure to pay child support, for one thing. There is talk of treason, but fewer people are taking that seriously.
Prow shook his head in disgust. Child support? What do you mean, child support?
Well, surely you didn't expect to get away without having to pay first.
For what? I asked incredulously.
Your son, of course.
I don't have a... And then I remembered my little tryst with female X in a drunken stupor. I had no idea who the mother was. Prow, my child, she...
He is the king.
The what?
Well, we had to select a monarch, and the heir of the Duke seemed to be a logical choice, especially since he was the first natural-born citizen of Hler.
I sat down. That was a lot to absorb. Okay, start at the beginning. Assume I know nothing about this. Prowl looked at me with disgust.
Did you read any of the emails I sent you?
I shook my head.
Nope.
Prowl looked angry.
Why not?
I sidestepped the questions. Who's the mother of the child?
Her name is Mary Susan.
I thought about it. I had no idea who Mary Susan was. It was bad enough that we were now linked by a child. What if she was ugly? How much child support was she getting? Why hadn't anyone told me? Of course, they had tried to tell me, and I'd ignored them. Okay, wait. Most of my money comes from Hler. Why didn't you just garnish my wages?
Hler's justice system won't work like that. You have to be here.
Then why didn't you subpoena me or something?
We couldn't find you, I shrugged.
When can I see my son? Prowl looked genuinely surprised.
You want to see him?
Of course I want to see him, you idiot. Why would you think otherwise? When was he born?
3 months ago.
Prowl looked shocked. You started hugging me a lot earlier than that.
Of course. She found out she was pregnant after only 2 weeks.
I'm going to need a lawyer.
One will be appointed to you, Prowl said.
I want to hire one, not some random civil servant.
With what money? All your assets have been frozen.
Frozen, not garnished? Interesting. Then how am I supposed to afford a decent lawyer?
You aren't. Darla doesn't like you, remember?
He smiled and left me alone. Thank goodness for small favors. I looked around my cell and found that it was still wired. After looking on the touchscreen interactive that was ubiquitous around Hler, I found that my hearing was scheduled the next day at 11 a.m. I found out that Quiescence the First was the talk of a lot of blogs on Hler. A surprisingly large minority did not like the idea of a monarchy, while most either loved it or thought it was some kind of hilarious joke. Apparently the, quote, Queen Mother, end quote, was minorly cute but not too bright. She also got drunk a lot. I suspected she'd done it while she was pregnant, but somehow she hadn't been caught until he had been born. She was a walking scandal and apparently loved it. The more I read, the bleaker things looked. Some people had been outraged at the idea, but Hler was going to spend money on the monarchy until someone did research and found out that I was now, quote, rich. Only the U.S. wouldn't freeze my accounts because it didn't recognize Hler. Apparently, I was supposed to fund the monarchy rather than the other way around. Given her personal habits, I thought the child might not be mine, but apparently the paternity test was indisputable. I don't recall giving them my DNA, but that didn't mean they weren't going to have it. One good thing about that was that there were going to be some foreign press there. They found the entire idea fascinating. Where there was an audience, there was a way. Then I found out that I could still send emails. I began sending emails to a few lawyers on Hler, but none were interested. Then I remembered the lawyer I'd hired back in California, Lexington. I contacted him, and he was ecstatic about the idea. The trial the next morning was a zoo. To start with, while Hler had been building like mad in the year since I'd left, they still hadn't gotten around to building any kind of decent courtroom. Land and space were, simply, at too much of a premium, especially since people wanted desperately to be able to move there, despite the numerous threats from the Russians. To solve the space problem, they had converted one of the mess halls into a makeshift courtroom, complete with velvet podium and set on the table. Speaking of the judge, it appeared to be one Nimbus Quimby, a New Zealander I'd done some work for. At first I was glad because we had a good working relationship, but then he scowled at me. The lawyer appointed to me was none other than Michael Onyx. I was somewhat shocked. "You're a lawyer?" He shook his head. "Not really, but I've got legal standing as an officer of the court. We don't have many laws, so passing the bar isn't really that hard. Since I'm already paid, plus the fact that I'm the only lawyer that doesn't despise you, it seemed the logical choice." "Thanks," I said sarcastically. Michael Onyx looked annoyed. "Hey, stop that. Most of us in security remembered how you stood with us at the wall and how you helped us right before you left." I smiled a bit. "Sorry, for some reason I didn't think I had any friends here." "I wouldn't say friends, but I'm grateful enough to keep you from being kangarooed here. Besides, it's a lot simpler now that you have your own lawyer." "That makes sense. Honestly, it was a nice change of pace." The judge heard Mary's lawyer first. He didn't paint a pretty picture. "We will show that His Grace deliberately ignored all attempts at contacting him. He is quite definitely His Majesty's father, as 3 accredited paternity tests have proven." Michael Onyx stood immediately after that statement and said, "Your Honor, my client has deep emotional reasons for not wanting to contact anyone from Hler. Given the circumstances, it was a perfectly rational response. In fact, until 24 hours ago, my client wasn't even aware that he had a son." Judge Quisby raised an eyebrow. "What emotional reasons might those be?" Michael Onyx smiled. There was something cold in his smile, something reptilian that I didn't like at all, but I was very glad he was on my side, for the moment at least. I kept my mouth shut, and he said, "I'm afraid that information cannot be revealed at this time." "Why not?" "National security." That caused an immediate reaction of shock around the courtroom. "But I can assure Your Honor that, as we speak, my client's chosen counsel is flying to Hler to represent him, and that he fully intends to pay child support as negotiated by his counsel. In fact, he demands full parental rights for his child." That caused an even greater stir in the courtroom, and the random talking grew so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Why was this shocking to them? What kind of monster did they think I was? I got some clue when I saw the look on Mary Susan's face. Apparently, she had not been expecting things to go this way. That was not a good sign. Since I was going to be having a relationship with a woman for the rest of my life, I tried to act civil, even if that relationship was only for the sake of our son. I thought about being a father for the first time. That tiny wonder at the opposite table was my son. He had my eyes and his mother's pinchy nose. I felt immense pride and horror. Was I ready for this? Not really, but I was going to have to be. The national security element pushed the story to the front page of several newspapers around the world. How could a tiny island like Hler even have security to worry about? My face was everywhere. I had people who worshipped me and people who wanted me dead, and I'd never even met them. My days of covertly sneaking into people's backyards and burning their pole shed was over. By the time night had come around, I hadn't heard from Amberlove. I called her several times, but got no answer. If she had been arrested, news about it wasn't appearing on the internet. My lawyer got in the next morning and met briefly with me. The judge agreed to allow him a week to examine the evidence and prepare the case. The judge wasn't sure what to do about it in relation to the Constitution. Lucky me. I still didn't know what the next step was, though I did know that somehow I had to infiltrate Hler's defenses and learn how their meme generators worked. There had to be a way to make a meme that would block all other memes and force people to think for themselves for a change. Was that even possible? Then again, how much did I trust a world that had elected President Hamburger? When the formal hearing started, everyone in the room was nervous. Hler had not exactly been forthcoming about the information about, quote, national security, though Michael told me that the judge had been briefed. I could tell he almost looked admiringly at me as he took the stand. Admiring? What the hell? Whatever. The proceedings were short, efficient, and entirely one-sided. I was actually surprisingly bored by the whole thing. The real problem, in retrospect, had been Mary Susan's rather extreme emotional shock at not having things go her way. Because she had her world turned upside down. She gave her lawyer in extremely irrational directions, and she refused to work with my lawyer at all. In fact, the only thing keeping Mary Susan from being entirely screwed was the fact that I didn't want to completely screw her over. I did, however, get the judge to agree that while I would pay a reasonable child support, a random act of sex in which Mary Susan with her did not entitle her to even a significant share of my earnings. We weren't married, and it was 2 weeks after the fact that she'd learned that she was pregnant and still hadn't talked to me. Finally, since Hler had made me my son the monarch, Hler could afford to pay any funds for royal events and the like rather than me. All in all, I was quite pleased with myself. Things did not usually go my way, so while I enjoyed the first day, I found myself becoming increasingly paranoid. What was going to go wrong? What was the catch? Surely there had to be some cosmic hammer out there to strike me with for the audacity of good fortune. And yet, disaster did not come. At first, I kept to myself in my quarters, still trying to get to grip on everything. I didn't answer my phone or my email, though I did hire a secretary to field calls of a life-threatening or freedom-altering magnitude. I got a bill from my lawyer and a few news articles about some crazy dictators suggesting that I should be arrested for my arrogance, but eventually I realized that it would have to deal with the world, and I still had not heard from Amberlove. It was troubling, very troubling. So I went outside. There were not a horde of people waiting outside my door, but I found out later from Michael that there was a very strict laws in Hler against harassment by the press. This was particularly odd for Hler, given how fanatical they were about such things, but Michael replied, "Your freedom to live your life is more important than their freedom to make a buck at your expense. They can still print whatever they want, as long as it isn't a lie and as long as they don't harass you about it. Still, that has turned some of the press against us, but that won't last long." He smiled slightly and walked off. I smiled back, but I didn't mean it. While I empathized with their press law, his very attitude towards memetics caused me to condemn it. Okay, fine. People were stupid, but that didn't stop me from wanting them to be smarter. The eyes of everyone in the restaurant were on me. No one but the waitress said anything, though she did act somewhat flirtatiously. "What'll you have? What's the special?" "We have a few things on the menu." There was something odd in her voice, but I was deliberately not paying attention to it. "Anything specific?" "The BLT is good, pretty good." "Let's try that then." She said, "Let's," with an amused smile and a flip of her notebook that I could not ignore. She was very attractive. Then again, I just doomed one female to imprisonment, another to slavery, and a third to make me a father for cash, so I was somewhat cautious. I smiled back, but didn't say anything until she brought the sandwich. "There's your sandwich," she said. "Thanks." "You're welcome." There was that quirky smile again. "So did you hear the news?" she asked. "I haven't really been getting out much." "Really?" She sounded surprised. "Well, it was kind of surprising to suddenly that I'm the father and a world celebrity. I have checked my email. Now, this just came out in the news, so they might not know." "Know what?" "So this is what my fame now meant, that I would have other people knowing more about my life than I did? Had a harmless prank, my attempt to become a duke, now caused me to forfeit my right to privacy? According to U.S. laws, I was by definition a public person, which meant the paparazzi could harass me to no end and I couldn't do anything about it. She shook her head sadly. "Mary Susan plans to sue you. She says that the trial on Hler was not legal because Hler isn't a nation. She has complained that Hler wouldn't let her take your son off of Hler. She's what? Suing you in U.S. court. Great. If I went back to the U.S., I was putting myself in the custody of the conspiracies. I decided not to take that chance. I stood up and nodded to the waitress. "Excuse me," she nodded, smiled sadly, and then winked. "Of course." I paid for my food and dashed back to my apartment. I picked up the phone. The waitress was right. There, Mary Soon was bold as brass, ready to sue me and take our son. Why, I hadn't even seen him in a week. That would change. "Hello?" my lawyer asked. "Are you watching television?" "If you mean the lawsuit, we're aware of it. She served papers here." "Yeah. If there's any consideration, we think she's an opportunity." Thanks. I hung up and went back to the restaurant. The waitress said, "Say, you look hungry. Would you like another sandwich?" "Sure." 5 minutes later, she showed up with a meticulously prepared tuna fish sandwich with crust sauce and a sprig of parsley on the side. The toothpick held all 4 quarters together, pinning the lettuce, bread, and tomatoes, while the tuna fish put off the ooze on the sides. It was extremely messy to eat, but very good. As I sat there eating my sandwich, occasionally looking up at the television, watching talking heads that had apparently knew more about me than I ever did, I noticed the total silence in the restaurant. As I looked around, I noticed at least 5 or 6 other people staring at me. I kept eating my sandwich. They sometimes ate something of their own. Eventually, I finished and we kept staring at each other. "Nice weather," I finally said. A big burly man in the back with another woman said, "It sucks." I nodded. "We're in Siberia." "Kamchatka," said a man in his early 40s and 20. The waitress said, "I heard it was Siberia on the news. Where did you get that name?" He shrugged and smiled. "Risk." The burly man laughed. "The board game?" "Yeah." "I wouldn't teach geography to my son based on a board game," the woman with the burly man said. Everyone laughed and the tension in the room tangibly cleared. I paid for the food again and went to my room. This nonsense had distracted me for long enough. That was when I remembered. Mary Susan had not taken my son with her. Where was he? I immediately called Michael Onyx. The first thing I asked him was, "Where is my son?" He replied, "I've been wondering when you'd ask. He's with us. We are taking care of him. We weren't going to let Mary Susan just take him with her. He's the king, after all. According to Hler law, you have custody of him, not Hler." "Excuse me?" "Your regent." "When did that happen?" 2 nights ago. Everyone on the governing council felt guilty about being so easily fooled." "While I appreciate the sentiment, that's not all." He sounded hesitant. "What is it?" "It's a good thing you call. The lawsuit is generating a lot of nervous feelings here." "I'm sorry for their loss," I responded with no attempt to hide my feelings. "It's serious. A lot of powerful people in Hler are calling for the repeal of the monarchy and their title. They're also calling for your expulsion." "I'm not surprised." "Darla is leading them." "Okay, that hurts some." "Her primary argument is your lack of interest in your son. They have another vote scheduled for tonight. This changes things. At least I presume it changes things. You are going to take charge of your son?" "Hell yes, I'm going to take custody of him. I didn't realize until the offer that I was yelling on the phone, 'Where is he?' "We'll bring him to you," he said, then hung up the phone. And a short while later, Michael Onyx and maybe half of the security team showed up with baby furniture, baby clothes, baby food, baby pictures, and a baby. They set it up, and the two of them even stayed behind to, quote, help, end quote. Help, in this case, meant make sure that I knew the first thing about raising a baby. I didn't. I learned fast, though. I learned that babies are loud and that they were messy, that they're adorable, particularly when it's your own child. There's a bond, a kind of wonder at knowing you helped create this squirming, smiling, giggling thing in front of you. Did I mention that they were also loud and messy? The 2 guards who stayed behind helped me get through the night. These were the people I was trying to destroy. I began having second thoughts. Maybe Hler wasn't so bad. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was Prow. Then I remembered my son's name was Quiescence Prow. I tried not to think about it. As soon as the sun rose, I got online and made arrangements to have a nanny help with, quote, quiz, end quote. I probably couldn't legally get his name changed, at least not here, but I certainly could raise him to be using something more normal, maybe Buzz or Phil. I think May and Panton, the 2 guards who'd stayed, and ordered breakfast. They had to show me the basics, and it would be 2 days before the nanny I had hired could show up. I hadn't even had time to interview them. Buzz began to cry and cry loudly. He wouldn't eat. He was clean. I tried everything I could think of to get him to stop, but he just wouldn't. I almost tried booze, but deemed that would set a bad precedent. Finally, I turned up the television in hopes that that would work. Remarkably, it did. He calmed right down, too quickly for my taste. Were there memes coming from the TV? Should I start wearing a tinfoil hat yet? I tried to get some work done, but to no avail. The television was simply too distracting. Pretty soon, there were going to be 2 mouths to feed, so I had to generate some money. Then I realized I was famous. I didn't want to be famous, but surely there had to be some way to get some money out of that. Or was that a trap? Paparazzi were already hounding me. I had become an icon and a symbol in a battle of wills and ideology that pitted nation against nation. Did I really want to make it worse by trying to cash in on it? Moreover, everything I did or said ended up being consumed by the public domain and twisted to their individual purposes. Maybe I could take a subtler approach than simply saying, "I'm famous, pay me money." I thought back at the restaurant. All the illusions painted about me by Mary Susan had melted away. Maybe something else could take its place. These thoughts came to a screeching halt as Buzz began to howl once again. Whatever had been on had now been replaced by a talking head, talking about other talking heads and the generic bias in the media. How amusing. How appropriate. I tried the standard rotation of "why is the baby crying now?" and discovered that this time he was hungry. It was nice to know that I was making some kind of progress at least. Finally, he slept. I was able to put in a few orders for documentation and software and actually found people genuinely friendly and interested in my normal business. I selected the best contracts and found the people I needed to help run them. It took several hours of doing, but it was very satisfying work, and I had actually accomplished something. Just as I was nodding to sleep, Buzz woke up again. Somehow, he'd known I was going to sleep, and had left the pleasant dream-filled slumberland of infants to stop me. Maybe it was tinfoil hat time after all. This pattern continued for 2 days until my new nanny arrived. She was Russian, moderately pretty, but slightly obese. She smelled of some kind of odd spice mixed with diesel fumes, and had all of her belongings packed up in a wicker basket. She cooked up a meal for me immediately, though that was not in her contract. I wasn't complaining, though, and I wasn't sure what she had in mind. I didn't want to ask her. She spoke more Russian than English, though according to what little I could gather, she wasn't Russian at all, but considered herself Mongolian. She didn't look Mongolian, but what do I know? Her name was unpronounceable to me. Unfortunately, it was written in Cyrillic, and her accompanying ID had at least 4 different ways of spelling it. How do you say your name? Lizana. Lizananda? Lizana. Lizanampa? Nanny. And Nanny it was from then on.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
Welcome to the secret commentary for Chapter 17. Chapter 16. So, these, like sands in the hourglass, these are the days in our micronation. Who would have guessed that Chester would have gotten a son? What a twist. I think at this point, I was kind of desperate to end the thing and came up with twist after twist after twist. And frankly, except for helping establish consequences for Chester, giving him a son, the lawsuit, the paparazzi, it's just shock value. It doesn't add to the story. I stand by what I said in my comments last chapter, which is I should have ended it after the final battle, and maybe at best had him rush up and do the meme thing, because I get why Chester wants to do a meme to counteract the other memes that affect people. It makes Chester a little bit more heroic, but the truth is, Chester is very much an anti-hero. He doesn't want to be a hero. He eventually decides he has to be one because nobody else can do the job, which I guess is kind of heroic, but he sure doesn't feel that way when I read him, and I doubt he did when I wrote him. The thing about Chester and Prow is that at the time they were two sides of me. So I guess if I was an asshole at the time, I now understand why people thought I was. Both Chester and Prow are just absolute fucking assholes. But then again, so are Darla, and I'm starting to think Amberlove is, who for a long time I thought wasn't an asshole, but She's at least the most ethical of the four. Anyway, I currently write poetry under the pseudonym Emmett Other, and sometimes I used to write Redwin Tercer versus Emmett Other, and it was more of a left brain, right brain kind of thing, with Emmett Other being my passionate, deep feelings, romance, mystery, with Redwin being the kind of poems that a member of my family writes. It's not really particularly good, but, it's about politics or your socks or something like that. And I've started to kind of leave that thinking behind. All the poems I write now are under Emmett Other, and even if it's not a good poem, I'll just own it. Technically speaking, I should be putting them all under Rhombus Text, but I like Emmett as a persona. I've been using him so long that I'm going to keep using him. What to say about this chapter? Well, it's not as terrible as the last one, but it's still kind of awful. It's good that Chester stepped up and stopped running and started taking responsibility, so it's a turning point in that standpoint. I don't have kids, but I've helped raise many of them, being the oldest of 7, as well as having about well over 20 nephews and nieces. And, knowing several, not all, several of them when they were very young. I wrote what I experienced. Except, of course, the joy of actually being a parent by proxy. And at this point, being 50 years old, looks like we're probably not going to have kids. It is what it is. But, Chester does the right thing. And, it's totally understandable that anybody in their right mind would not want to have contact with Quiescence Prow. Totally understandable why Chester wouldn't check himself into an asylum. If he's in a top-secret government prison and Prow bothers him there, no place else is safe. Honestly, not much else to be said about this chapter.